Good luck, everybody.
Hello, everybody. Welcome in. And because we've got a good number, we're going to start straight away. So this is recording, just to let everybody know. My name's Matt Quaife. I work in Evidere's patient preference team. I'm one of the conveners of the Health Preference Research Special Interest Group of IHEA. And welcome to the first of 4, potentially 5 webinars arranged jointly between IHEA, that's the International Health Economics Association, the International Academy of Health Preference Research, and the Patient Journal on best practices in health preference research. To my knowledge, this is the first of this kind of collaboration between these organisations. I think it's really great to get together as a group of people who are interested in health preference research from different perspectives. I hope over the course of these we could have some good discussion. We can bring in perspectives from academia, from industry, from consulting, from policy, from anyone else who's joining. So very grateful to the organisers, IHEA, for hosting us, for the leadership of the International Academy of Health Preference Research for encouraging these, and Chris Carswell, the patient, for his support of this sort of work. This is the schedule you'll see on screen over the next few months, and each of these webinars has its own registration link, which I'll put in the chat. So if you do want to come to all 4, you have to register for all 4, and we've got all of your details. So we will send around a link after the session as well. Now, these are based on papers published in the Patient Journal from IAHPR initiative. So it started as a textbook. It ended up as this really neat and succinct collection of papers of key steps, best practices for good preference studies. And within IHEA, the last conference, we heard from our membership that there was a demand for a preference study 101s, like robust, good practice sessions. So, it's a match made in heaven for these sorts of sessions when we knew the paper series was coming out. So we're very grateful for Semra and Richard today and the authors of all the papers in the series to come and present. The first webinar today is on data collection methods in health preference research. In later weeks, we'll get to how we choose preference methods, how we design them to make sure we're getting good data. But today it's data collection, something that I'm sure we all think about. And with that in mind, a bit of housekeeping for today. We'll hold verbal questions to the end, but please feel free to post in the chat or have a discussion after the presentation. So the session's got 2 aims. One is to get the best practice steps from Semra and Richard out there for perhaps newer researchers to get an overview, but it'll also be really good to hear from the room on nuances or different experiences that you have relevant to that content. And I know Richard and Semra are on board with that. One conflict of interest for me is that I'm actually an author on this paper, but I'm wearing my organisational hat today, and I'm grateful of the bigger beasts of Semra and Richard to come and present. So introductions. Semra Ozdemir is an associate professor at the influential preference team at Duke. She's got a joint appointment at Duke NUS Medical School in Singapore, and Semra is a real expert in data preference methods. I know Semra's early work on hypothetical bias and cheap talk in particular has been really influential for me, and your risk-benefit studies more recently, so it's great to have your input today. Richard Norman is a professor at the Curtin School of Population Health, and Richard works across a range of areas. He's a permanent member of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee and its Economic Subcommittee. Now, I know a lot of Richard's work has been influential about how to actually use preference methods, particularly in health state valuation. And while some of us are spending our days fiddling about with experimental designs and distributions on choice models, Richard's spending his days working out how to actually get preference data into informing decisions and used in real life. So it's great to have both of you. Without further ado from me, I'm going to hand over to you, Semra, to share your screen for our presentation today.
Sure, thank you, Matt. Okay. Oh, I am sorry. Okay, I shared the wrong screen, although we did this just now. Okay. Okay, can you see the slides okay now?
Looks great, yeah.
Okay, do you see it in the slide mode? Is that okay?
We see a lovely full screen slide, Semra, you're good to go.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matt. So yeah, we will be talking about an overview of data collection today. So it will be me and Richard, but we have Matt and Atisha Mohammed also as co-authors. As Matt mentioned, this paper was published in The Patient just a few months ago. So if you want more details about the paper and especially the citations, just refer to the paper. So the paper really covers a bunch of different topics, but there's no way we can cover all of them in this presentation. So we're going to really focus on survey administration modes and sampling frame today, and data quality. So some of the information I'm going to give you is, kind of not really specific to health preference research. There's quite a bit overlap with any survey research. However, we try to also give specific examples from health preference research when we're talking about data collection methods and sampling. So one of the first things we want to talk about the different survey administration modes. And, this is, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. As in any other survey research, health preference research also is usually done by 3 types of administration modes: mail surveys, web-based surveys, and face-to-face surveys. And we're going to talk about the pros and cons of each survey mode. So let's look at the trends in the literature in health preference research. Especially if you look at the bottom of the table, one of the first things you will see, first of all, the health preference research surveys have increased tremendously over the years. It was a handful of them maybe in 1990s, early 2000s, and then it just now there are way many more researchers and surveys done in this area, which is great. And in terms of the survey modes, like paper surveys used to be the most common in 1990s, even early 2000s. But within the last 10 years, especially with, I think, advancements in technology, online surveys really took over. So they become the most commonly used administration mode. As I said, we're going to talk about the different survey modes and discuss their advantages and disadvantages. So the first one, let's start with the mail surveys, as probably that was the first approach or survey mode that's been used in survey research. Traditionally, mail surveys reaches nationally representative samples, of course, assuming that there are postal addresses. There's a good postal service in a country, and then you have access to the postal addresses. So this can be for higher middle income countries and higher income countries like US or Australia. This has been an ideal way to reach to general population surveys, especially if you're really interested in representation, because you can get the postal addresses of everybody, so they have a chance to be a participant in a survey. And mail surveys are relatively easy to implement as well, as long as you have the postal addresses. That's the difficult part. But as long as you have the postal addresses, they're relatively easy to implement and distribute, assuming you have good postal service in that country. And also historically, mail surveys are the most familiar format for people, right? Paper survey, that's what historically people are used to. But of course, with things are changing now, trends are changing. Like if you ask my kids, for them, it's everything online. So that's what they're used to. So it's, but for middle income to, middle ages to, I think older ages, paper surveys still might be the most familiar format. And mail surveys actually also produce higher response rate. This is something I was really surprised when we were working on this paper. Even when you look at the most recent literature now that's published, and I must say there aren't that many studies that's been done recently, but when you look at the surveys, that's studies that compare web surveys to mail surveys yield higher response rate. However, I think this is historically true, but given how things are changing now with technological advancements and wide access to Wi-Fi, this trend is changing. So let's talk about the disadvantages of mail surveys. So one of the things, as I mentioned before, you really need the postal addresses and a good postal service to be able to distribute your surveys. And it is time consuming. It takes a long time to, mail these surveys and wait for response. And there might be, undeliverable surveys. So it takes time. And another disadvantage is that because the data comes in paper format, you have to enter the data manually, and this can lead to, potential for errors. So the gold standard is double data entry, but this still there's potential for error, and also it takes time and effort. And speaking of response rate, we are seeing declining response rates, even though they may still produce higher rates than other survey methods. There's definitely a declining response rates, especially with certain populations, which I'm going to talk about more later. Let's talk about the face-to-face surveys. Face-to-face surveys are great for really engaging the respondents. It's a great way to get people's attention, so that they're really paying attention to the survey. And you can really, the interviewers are there to control if there are any problems, for recruitment, for the process to run smoothly. If there are any problems, they can solve it right there. So in that sense, it's great. Also, having interviewers there to clarify any questions, any texts, that's another way to really increase the data quality, right? Enhance data quality. So especially for, some of choice questions in health preference research, like some of the discrete choice experiment questions, they can be complex, a lot to process. And it's in that sense, face-to-face surveys are great because the interviewers are there to help patients, the respondents, understand the context, understand the questions, and be able to answer them. So all of this really helps to increase the data quality. Of course, this comes with a cost, right? It is face-to-face surveys can be really costly because you need to recruit people to do the surveys. You need to train them, and depending on your recruitment sites, there might be quite a bit travel expenses attached to, intercepting respondents and talking to them. And also this can take time, especially if you are targeting geographically dispersed samples. It can take time to um, uh, complete these surveys and reach the target sample size. Another major disadvantage of face-to-face surveys is the potential for social desirability bias, because the presence of someone next to you, and or you're answering their questions. Some people may not feel very comfortable to be upfront, and others they may not be able to, they may alter their responses. For example, in a contingent valuation survey, if there's a willingness to pay question, if there people, especially I have seen this in lower income countries, in lower middle income countries, people hesitate to say no. They may say yes to a willingness to pay question. Or for sensitive topics, they may not be very, comfortable discussing sensitive topics, like topics related to sexual health or mental health. They may not feel comfortable giving the responses, right responses in front of someone. Let's talk about the web-based surveys. Web-based surveys are great for rapid data collection, and geography is not a problem because we can reach out to anywhere with web-based surveys, which is great. And web surveys also great for automating things, right? If you have skip patterns, they can be easily done with web surveys. Or if you have any different versions of the survey, you're doing an experiment, or even if you don't have a different version, but we have usually discrete, especially discrete choice experiments, you have all these different blocks, right? People are randomly assigned to different sets of choice questions. So all this is very easy to do with web surveys. And also from the respondent perspective, web surveys can be very flexible right? They can do the survey whenever they want, respondents. They can take a break, come back. So in that sense, it's easier for them, more flexible for them. And another advantage of web surveys is the automatic data entry. You don't have to do any manual entry. Once you collect the data, it's there. Once you're done recruiting, it's there. So it reduces the errors, which is great. And web surveys are usually cost effective. I said usually because there's always exceptions depending on your target sample, but usually they're lower cost compared to face-to-face surveys or mail surveys. So what are the disadvantages of web surveys? So one of them is the sampling bias. As I mentioned earlier, web surveys require stable internet connection, and they also require access to a device, right? They need to have a laptop or a smartphone or a tablet. So all these things mean that, only certain type of people may be responding to web surveys, such as younger people or tech-savvy people or more educated or higher income individuals. So there's potential for sampling bias. And also web surveys require certain digital literacy, right? Someone may be higher income or they may not have any problems purchasing, having a Wi-Fi, but they may not be very comfortable using tech or tablets to answer surveys. Especially this may be the case for older individuals. They may struggle using answering questions in a web survey. Earlier, I mentioned flexibility for respondents. They can, come back or answer the questions survey whenever they want. They can get a break. But also, this is a disadvantage in terms of data quality, because then respondents may be less focused, right? If they give a break, they may forget about what they read. They may get distracted. There might be noise around. So this all influences the data quality. And speaking of data quality, this fraudulent data, this is a big concern. It's increasingly becoming a major concern. In the past, we were worried about humans taking the surveys again and again to get the incentives or providing fake responses. Now with the AI technology, there's all these AI bots taking surveys. Now we have to, and it's much easier and widespread. This is becoming more and more common, especially in open platforms. So as researchers, we really need to be more worried about this and take steps to check for fraudulent data. Richard is going to talk about that later, more about this. So in terms of, as I have been talking about different survey modes, as you have heard, like there's really pros and cons to each survey mode. So which one to choose really depends on your target population. So if you are targeting older individuals, maybe web survey is not the best way to go. For example, I have done a series of surveys with older individuals with end-stage kidney disease. So there's several issues with this sample. One is we were targeting people over 70, so they're not tech savvy at all. Like digital literacy is low among this population. And also it is they are really sick. They have multiple comorbidities, so it's harder for them to also do anything alone. So that's why we did face-to-face surveys with this target population, and intersected them and went through the survey with them, explained them everything again and again if they needed to. Versus web surveys can be great if you want to do, general population surveys, especially, during COVID-19 pandemic, right? We were all stuck in our homes and there were a huge explosion of, I think, survey research around that time, including health preference research. So, I mean, a preference survey research is done regarding COVID-19 vaccine or the pandemic restrictions, preferences around restrictions. They were all done in web surveys, and it was great to get quick responses right away, right? Because we needed timely information, and these web surveys a great way to do in this kind of circumstances. Mail surveys are becoming less and less common. Honestly, I have done my only mail survey like 20 years ago during my for my master's thesis. So I don't have much experience, but they're still being used, but it's becoming, as we mentioned, less common. So it really depends on when you are, choosing a survey mode. It really depends on your target population and how you're planning to recruit them. So there is some research, luckily, some research among health preference research within health preference research, looking at whether survey mode impacts study findings. There aren't that many, only a handful of them, but there is some evidence. For example, Mulhern compared a computer-assisted personal interview, so these are face-to-face interviews, with online surveys, and they found significant differences in respondent characteristics. As not surprising, the online surveys tend to have more younger individuals and students versus the computer assistant interviews. They tend to be older individuals or retired individuals. This was just one of the differences. However, the good news is when they controlled for demographic differences, there was no difference. They found no difference in valuations across modes. There are a few other studies like Rowan and Chiang recently just last year published. They compared online surveys and face-to-face surveys. So they found that both the respondent characteristics and the responses were different across modes. So we are seeing mixed findings. Again, another study with Verity Watson. This has been done a few years back. They compared CAPI, mail surveys, and online surveys. Again, they found different response rates, not surprising, different willingness to pay estimates. And then one of the studies I want to get your attention is done by Detterman. What they did is they used the same sampling frame. So unlike the other studies, they use the same sampling frame and then compared the online and mail survey. And surprisingly, not surprisingly, sorry, they didn't find any differences in respondent characteristics because they're using the same sampling frame. And they found that, online surveys performed as good as the mail surveys, which is great. However, they found that willingness to pay estimates were higher for the online survey than the mail survey. I think it's great that we have this research and have although they have mixed findings, I think these findings may change as the trends are changing. More and more we're switching towards online surveys. More and more people, even in lower income countries or in high or middle income countries, among lower income populations, Wi-Fi is becoming more common. Smartphone use is becoming more common, so it's easier to access these populations. But that doesn't mean that just doing a online survey, you're going to reach this population. You need to do a lot of effort while in recruitment during data collection to make sure you reach these populations. Okay, so from here forward, we're gonna switch, and Richard is going to take over. Richard, do you want me to continue controlling the slides, or?
I'm happy to take over control if you want.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, sorry, just great.
Yep. Right. Can you all see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. So I think that survey administration, both generally and in the context of health preference research, is really interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a field when, in my view, there's no gold standard. So the appropriate mode of administration is almost entirely context specific, as is the appropriate approach to sampling, which is what I'm going to be talking about. So as an analyst, unfortunately, I don't feel like Semra and I and Matt and Atisha can give you a clear steer about how you should use your study. But I think the best piece of advice we can give is that you should be cognizant of all of the advantages and disadvantages, and then think about how that applies in your particular context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about target populations and frame populations in sampling. I'll then give a couple of slides around strategies for maximizing data quality, particularly in the context of online surveys as they become increasingly widely used. Then I'll hopefully conclude with a bit of time for questions and comments afterwards. So to give you some definitions, the target population for preference research is defined as the entire group of individuals that the research aims to make inferences about. So to give you an example, we might be interested in the preferences of late-stage lung cancer patients in the US, so treatment or care options in that population. Now, there is a distinction between the target population and the frame population. So the frame population is the actual group from which the survey sample is drawn. And it may be that we do have the frame population and the target population being the same. So Semra's example of getting literally every single person's address across the country gets you to a situation where the frame population and the target population are not exactly the same, but they're pretty close. However, that's probably not a common situation, and typically the frame population is a subset of the target population. So in our case of stage 4 lung cancer patients, we might ask our preference survey in patients visiting oncology clinics through a particular provider, and that's a perfectly reasonable approach to take. But as analysts, we have to think about whether there's any reason why the frame might be different from people not included in the frame. So if we're using Duke clinics, the stage 4 lung cancer patients at Duke, are they likely to be different to people who aren't going to clinics or people who are going to different clinics? And that's again, obviously context specific. So sampling matters, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this information already. Sampling matters because it determines how representative the survey results are. We want our survey results to be as representative of the entire population as possible. So we need to think about how to do that, both in terms of how we get our sample and then also potentially how we analyze our sample as well. So there is the option of population weights to adjust for non-representativeness, for instance. Two main schools of sampling based on whether they're probabilistic or not. And I'll talk through each of them now. But loosely speaking, under probability sampling, every individual in the population has a known non-zero chance of being selected and approached for inclusion in the study. Non-probability sampling is anything that's not probability sampling, such as when individuals are selected based on availability or convenience. And you do see both reasonably frequently in the literature, and I'm not sure if I'd be confident suggesting a trend over time. So you need to be familiar with both. Okay, so in terms of probability sampling, some examples are here. The first one is much more common than the second. In the first one, which is simple random sampling, every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. So if we had a database of every stage 4 lung cancer patient in the US, and we picked a random sample of 1,000 to be approached to participate in a study, that's the kind of thing we mean by simple random sampling. Similar to that, you do see occasional instances of systematic sampling where you select every, for instance, nth individual from a list. It's easy to implement. You don't need any kind of randomization software or anything like that. I don't think it's widely used in health preference studies, so I'll raise it just for information, but I won't linger on that point. Okay, some other examples of probabilistic sampling. Stratified sampling is a possibility. So if you are, this is particularly relevant when you're interested potentially in analyzing subgroups later. So if you divide your population into subgroups based on age, gender, education, experience of illness, or so on, you then randomly select from each subgroup to make sure that you are capturing all of those combinations. I think that's potentially really valuable when you're interested in exploring the heterogeneity of preferences across a population. We've said here that ensures representation across key characteristics. That's broadly true. What it certainly does is if people respond to the survey at different rates, so say women respond to a survey and men tend not to respond to a survey, what will be clear is you'll see that pattern that'll come out in your data, and you'll be able to adjust for it in subsequent sampling. So that's important. The final probabilistic sampling approach I'll talk about is cluster sampling, where the population is divided into clusters such as geographical regions or clinics. And you take a random selection of clusters, and then within each cluster, you take a random selection of people. And this is, in terms of ensuring representativeness, there are issues with that in terms of how representative each cluster is of the entire population. But there are significant advantages in frequently in taking this kind of approach when you have large geographically dispersed populations. So if you're say you're in a low middle income country and you're interested in primary care services, it's much more challenging to draw from every possible primary care provider than it is to identify a set of primary care providers at random and take larger samples from each cluster. It reduces your costs significantly, and depending on context, may have only a very minor impact on the representativeness of your eventual sample, which is it can be a appropriate trade-off to make. Okay, in terms of non-probability sampling, there are a few examples which overlap to some degree as well. So you will see many examples of health preference research where a convenience sample is used, which involves selecting individuals readily available to the analyst. This is often good for pilot work. It's problematic in terms of trying to generalize to the entire population, because people being available often predict something about them. So the most available patients often have characteristics different to the patients that are not immediately conveniently accessible. Judgmental and purposive sampling, where is something you see as well, where researchers deliberately select individuals who they believe represent the population. And the final example I want to give is snowball sampling, where you use existing study participants to recruit future participants from among their acquaintances. This is challenging in some regards because it can lead to bias. So if people know people like themselves, so the people recruited through this kind of method are often likely to be more similar to the people who recruited them than the rest of the population. But I do think the point about reaching hard to reach populations is really important. So we did some preference work around telehealth last year, and we were interested in the kinds of design of primary care that makes it attractive to be delivered through telehealth. And we used snowball sampling there because it was a method for getting at people for whom English was not a first language and were not likely to be in our standard methods of recruiting consumers. And we actually got a really big focus group of native Japanese speakers who we would have never got to otherwise. So I think there are many instances where snowball sampling is actually completely appropriate. As an analyst, you just have to think about whether the advantages are likely to be worth it, given the potential issues around bias that you get from that kind of approach. Okay, I want to walk through some sampling issues which are again somewhat overlapping, but it's as much about laying out the issues and giving you the definitions as trying to get a sense of how important each of them are relative to one another. The selection bias occurs when some members of the target population are more likely to be included in the sample than others. And a good example of this is when you conduct a health preference research survey in a clinic. which may exclude patients who don't regularly visit health facilities. And that's really important because attendance or non-attendance at healthcare facilities can often plausibly drive or be correlated with preferences around health delivery. So the question around selection bias, the importance of it is typically context specific, and it depends upon whether the non-representativeness is likely to be correlated with preferences or not. And one way of mitigating selection bias is to use a more diverse and representative sampling frame that reflects the full range of the target population. Okay, sampling bias is a similar concept, and it happens when the actual sample differs from the intended population due to the way that individuals are selected. And Semra talked about this a bit already. A really good example of this is conducting an online survey in a population with low internet access because they can overrepresent tech-savvy, high-income individuals. So in the work that I talked about a couple of slides ago around preferences for virtual care, so telehealth, we did conduct an online survey, and one of the big problems we had with that was that by definition, the people who were willing to engage with a survey conducted through a web browser are probably also more likely to be willing to engage with health services delivered online as well. So that was a concern that we had. One way to mitigate sampling bias is to employ stratification or cluster sampling to ensure these underrepresented groups are included. Okay, non-response bias is, again, very important, and it occurs when certain groups within the sample are less likely to respond, leading to unrepresentative data. And that's very much a problem, and that there are a few ways of dealing with it. So you can make your survey more accessible to those groups who are less likely to respond. So offering multiple survey modes to increase participation across diverse groups is one strategy. You can similarly consider follow-up reminders to boost response rate. You can also work post hoc to reweight your sample to give greater weight to those people who are statistically less likely to respond as well. There are a few other strategies to deal with there, but I'll maybe talk about that after I finish my formal slides. As with any other survey, health preference research is subject to random sampling error. So random sampling error just says that you're drawing a random sample from the entire population, and depending on the size of that population, it can have potentially quite a large difference at random between the sample that you've drawn and the entire population. And the conventional way of mitigating that is through using particularly online surveys and very large sample sizes, which reduce random sampling error. There is a growing literature in the health preference space around power calculations. There was a really excellent paper a couple of years ago by some of our Dutch colleagues looking at power calculations in DCEs. But when you look at the literature generally, you still see a range of rules of thumb around appropriate sample sizes to estimate desired effect sizes. Okay, to finish off the issues of bias before I talk about data quality, two other things to raise. So coverage bias happens when the sampling frame doesn't fully represent the target population, which you can mitigate using a better sampling frame effectively. And an access device bias, which is closely related to non-response bias. Often when we present health preference research studies, we're asking quite complicated tasks, and we exclude types of devices through which people access content. So typically mobile phones are excluded. This is to try to improve the quality of the data, but it probably excludes a subset of the population who will only access surveys through their mobile phone and won't do so using a desktop or an iPad or whatever. Okay, I want to finish off just by talking about data quality, specifically in the context of online DCEs. And this is a really rapidly growing area. And I think that one of the risks of recording a webinar talking about this kind of topic is that when it may already be out of date, but I know for a fact in 2 years' time, the stuff I talk about now is going to be wildly out of date. So I want to give a sense of the overall principles and give you some examples of what we're currently doing. So one of the things about online DCEs and online health preference research more generally is that they reduce costs significantly. So particularly relative to face-to-face interviews, the cost per respondent is tiny as a proportion. But one of the issues is that even if we can get a large sample size, if a significant proportion of respondents are either bots or people just clicking through for a reward, then having that additional sample is of no value, and indeed can systematically potentially bias your results in a way which brings into question the validity of your study more generally. There are numerous strategies in the literature for trying to ensure that respondents are both real and engaged. But I would say that none of these are definitive. So one thing that can be done is to collect timestamp data. So many online softwares can identify both the amount of time people spend in the entire survey, but also the time that people spend on each individual page. And you often see studies introduce an arbitrary threshold where they determine that the person has progressed through the survey too fast. And that is arbitrary, but I think it's a useful way of trimming the absolute fastest people out of the survey because they're not likely to be providing useful data necessarily. That's a slightly complicated. There is a but to that, but I'll maybe talk about that later. Another strategy you see used often is the use of repeat questions. So asking the same question twice within a survey with the expectation that people who are engaged and real are more likely to successfully answer the same question the same way twice. In the context of the DCE or the health preference question, I'm a bit hesitant about using repeat questions because I think they're not the best way of identifying poor quality data. I think one thing that is good in terms of repeat questions is asking the same demographic question at the start and at the end, potentially in different ways. So one thing we've been doing recently is at the start of the survey, you ask for an age category for the person as part of quota sampling. And then near the end, you ask for a year of birth, and the two should obviously match up. They're different questions. They wouldn't be recognized as linked, but there is a logical relationship between the two, which bots and disengaged people are much, much more likely to fail. Dominant choice tasks have been used where you present two options where option A is clearly better than option B. Increasingly, you can use free text responses to identify poor quality data. So if you ask questions which require a full sentence related to the task that's preceded it, you can often get a pretty good sense of bot activity. I think bots are getting quite clever in that space, and they can often generate text which looks potentially plausible. So again, it's not a perfect approach, but it does have some value. And finally, you can see studies which use things like capture type tasks, which are, again, useful, but not 100% infallible when it comes to poor quality data. I would also say that you can also mitigate to some degree poor quality data when you analyze it through things like garbage class models, where you try to draw out people answering at random. But it's beyond the scope of the talk today, sorry. And maybe we can talk about that later. So in terms of data quality, I think there's no silver bullet in terms of preventing poor quality data entering your final data set. But I do think that there are a range of strategies, each of which will identify some poor quality data, and collectively they probably do a pretty good job at the moment. you want to make sure that your sample is recruited through a reputable panel with processes for removing poor performing respondents. You need to test your survey with real people to explore comprehension. So the survey itself has to be clear and well explained. So poor quality data reflects something about the respondent rather than something about the survey. Potentially, you can use exclusion based on repeat choice tasks, dominant pairs, weird free text responses, and so on. You can also exclude respondents based on response patterns. So if they speed through the survey at implausibly fast rates, that's potential for exclusion. Similarly, if they are a straight liner where, for instance, they answer A to every single task in a discrete choice experiment, then you may consider that they're likely to be giving you poor quality data. And finally, I think there's a potential to do something in analysis as well. So they've got these kind of garbage class models, which are becoming increasingly popular in the literature. But to summarize the talk more generally, I think that collection of health preference data has many of the same considerations as collection of any other data. I think there's no perfect way to collect data, which applies across all contexts. Rather, you've got to think about the different modes of administration and the different sampling techniques which apply best to your specific topic. So the researcher to make the same point, the researcher has to be aware of the biases resulting from their choice of collection methods and have a robust mitigation strategy, which might involve multiple means of data collection or just some sense of how to mitigate the inevitable risks of any kind of data collection. As Semra showed in one of the previous slides, health preference research data is moving as a field towards online modes, and for good reasons. And I think that online data collection is often the best approach, particularly when you're looking at general population samples. But using this kind of online mode, we as a research field are in a bit of an arms race with people providing very, very poor quality data, either in person or through artificial means. And we need to be smart around how we work with panels, how we build our surveys to make sure that the data we get is truly reflective of what the community feels about the particular question we're trying to answer. So that's everything I think we wanted to say, and we've got 15 minutes for questions or comments.
Fantastic. Thank you, Semra. Thank you, Richard. I think if you listen carefully, you'll hear the round of applause going on across the world. We've had just a couple of comments in the chat, not a huge amount of activity. Bennett or Oliver, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Otherwise, perhaps we could direct presenters to the chat. Don't know if you guys.
All right, can you hear?
Yeah, loud and clear, Bennett. Go for it.
All right, so I find that there's a wider variety of techniques that we might draw upon for internal validity, and to both to check it and make it more likely. So cheap text is something that the folks at DCRI do a lot, which is sort of text to engage people more in the survey, make it more real to them, make it like they're talking to a physician. And then there's face validity. Like if you have major stroke and minor stroke, and your minor stroke has a higher weight, you know something's wrong. There are other couple of funny things. We once did the survey in the US, the UK, and Spain for a cardiovascular disease. The people in Spain were over 25 years younger. This is a disease of older people. Just some of the demographics told us we had bias. So I think you could take it further.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I agree with both of those points. Semra, maybe would you want to add anything about the cheap talk approach? Because I know you've got a lot of expertise in the area.
Yeah, I think cheap talk has started really in environmental economics, and I must say a lot of the health preference research kind of if you follow what health environmental economics researchers have been doing. That's definitely a great way to kind of communicate directly to the survey respondents. Hey, okay, we know there's a researcher, there's a researcher behind the survey, and there's a reason we're doing this, and we understand, you're in a hurry, maybe you have lots of things going on. You can frame it in really different ways, but there is the aim really is to kind of explain the respondents that their responses matter. We really care about their responses. And also letting them know that we know sometimes people just go through this quickly, like letting them that, so to get their attention, the fact that they might do it so that they don't do it, right? So I haven't seen Cheap Talk research published recently. It's been a while. Maybe there's some new evidence, but some of the older evidence that I'm familiar with and some of the research we have done definitely show that it helps to get tighter responses and estimates when Cheap Talk is used.
Yeah, and sorry, just to jump in there, I think one of the
Sure.
reasons we haven't seen much additional literature is because it's perhaps one of the few examples in our field where there's not really a counter argument to using it. I think it either helps or it doesn't particularly hinder. I think we should all be certainly considering it, and except in really extreme situations, I don't see many counterexamples when it would actually harm the quality of the data.
Yeah, I agree. Mm-hmm.
Anything you'd like to come back on, Bennett? Any other?
What do you think about reimbursement? I've always thought that too little, they don't pay attention. Too much, you're going to get malingerers who just want to make money. Is there a sweet spot?
That's a good question. And that's really like, there's definitely like those are real concerns, right? Like you don't want to overpay, and you're going to get all these, people trying to do the survey just to get the incentive, but you want it to be high enough that people feel like, their time is worth it, and they spend the time to pay attention to the survey and complete the survey. And in addition to that, I think who you are surveying also matters. For example, in my studies, I tend to pay to older and sicker individuals. It's harder to get their time and attention versus maybe general population surveys. You have a larger pool of people, of course, so we pay them a little bit, lower than individuals with certain type of disease, especially if the severity of disease is quite high. So I don't have a direct answer to you, Bennett, like this is the right amount, but yeah, these are all the considerations to think about when you're really, deciding what incentive makes sense.
I can just chime in on incentives because it's something that we faced this week. Actually, I quite like it when our recruitment vendors or people inputting say, "Oh, that maybe isn't quite enough." I think it's good to be just on the margin of participation. You don't want everyone jumping into your survey, and you don't want nobody completing it. I think trying to arrange it so that some people find it too little, some people find it sufficient, is a good place to be. So I'm always slightly encouraged when I get a bit of pushback on the amount we're paying people to participate in our work.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a bit of stuff going on in the chat. Kazungu, I thought I might throw it to you next. Congratulations, Kazungu, who's just submitted his PhD. Would you like to unmute and ask a question or make a comment?
Thanks, Matt. Always good to hear your supervisor put you on the spot. But I mean, it's just a comment and trying to highlight some of the issues, especially related to the context when choosing the data collection approach. So we've been with Matt running a DC in Kenya. We use the face-to-face approach, but still even with that, based on the level of literacy across different participants who you need them in the survey, then there is actually an emphasis on, even guiding some pockets of people within that survey even more as compared to other groups. So I think in consideration and different, you might have a good postal system, for instance, But if you pose it to people and they're not sure, you know, what is engaged in what is required of them, that whole process is quite tricky. So I think that should be a very good consideration as well. Over.
Yeah, I agree completely, and congratulations, by the way. So I think that the one thing that occurred to me while you were talking is the importance of piloting not just the survey but your preferred sampling approach as well. And by piloting, I mean both running the DCE as you would in the main study, but I also think that kind of think aloud approach, which is quite widely used in health preference research, is really valuable. So if you can get in front of somebody with relatively lower literacy and get them to talk through how they're completing the survey and see that they're actually able to engage with it and able to understand what you're asking of them, that's crucial in terms of making sure that the data you get from them actually, whether you're actually able to capture their preferences adequately or not. So it means that the survey takes a little bit longer, but I think that kind of qualitative pre-testing is really, really valuable.
Just in the interest of time, we've probably got time for, I think, one more question. So thanks, Caitlin and Deborah, Rebecca. But Richard, I'm going to direct this one to you because I think it'd be good to have a summary of this. What do we do when people fail those sensitivity analysis checks? There's a bit of there's been a bit of a ding dong about that for the last few years. I wonder what your perspectives are on it.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't really have a clear answer. So there are two approaches, and I think it goes back to whether you think that their failure is a potential red flag or whether it's absolutely disqualifying. So if somebody says that they, you know, were born in 1950 and then tell you that they're 72 years old, it's in the ballpark correct, and you it's a bit of a red flag. And what I would do is, with that kind of category of person, run the model with and without them and see if it actually matters. And if it doesn't impact on coefficients much at the mean level, include them, or on the side of inclusion. But while that's, I think, a sensible approach, that doesn't really answer the problem, because the problem is, at what point is a red flag disqualifying? And that's the question I don't know the answer to. So generally speaking, yes, look at it in sensitivity analysis, but there will be instances where you will want to completely disqualify. So if you have, one thing we had in a recent study was we put in a free text box about how did you answer the question, and we had like 50 respondents give exactly word for word the same nonsensical response. And to me, that breaches the threshold of, no, we don't trust that data, we don't want that data, and we exclude it. And then I wouldn't be running sensitivity analysis. I'd be knocking on the door of the panel and saying, what are you giving us, and trying to get our money back.
Thanks, Richard. And Semra, to you, and any last comments or?
Yeah, I want to say one thing. I think this relates to what Kazingo mentioned earlier in terms of what some of the factors we consider choosing this what survey mode we're going to use. Like for example, in Singapore, there's perfect postal addresses. You have addresses, like you have, you can reach. There's online service, great online service. It's great. But I tended to do my surveys in person, particularly because the kind of people we were surveying in most of our surveys were people with terminal disease. And like they are really sick, mostly older, so digital literacy is a little bit lower, but they still can do, use computers and such. So in-person interviews really help because they're so sick already, you know, they're dealing with so many things, like asking them to do web survey versus doing in-person, talking to them. I found that really helpful because sometimes patients just want to talk about themselves. They're happy that someone is talking to them. Like, you know, this may be different in different cultures, Asia versus West, I don't know. But like that really worked great just to get good quality data and getting response rates, you know, high response rates. So just some final thoughts. Thank you.
Lovely. Well, thank you both. We are bang on time, so we'll close it there. Thank you very much, Semra and Richard, for your presentations. We'll send round details of the follow-up webinars, but just to say thank you very much for joining. Thank you everyone who's been involved in organising these, and hope everyone has a good afternoon, morning, evening, bright and early morning. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks,
Yeah,
everybody.
thank you. Bye.